The people of Harrow County still whisper about the night the lamps went out in the old manor, and how the wind seemed to carry a woman's scream across the river delta. They say the land remembers everything, every sin, every betrayal, and in Mississippi, the soil is thick with both. But no tale clings as stubbornly to the cotton fields as the story of the widow who traded her own blood for the illusion of power. Back in 1846, when the riverboats moaned like dying animals and the fog rolled in heavy as sorrow, Eleanor Harrow stood at the top of her rotting estate and watched her world collapse under the weight of secrets her husband left behind. Debts circled her like vultures, tearing at what little remained of her fortune. But Eleanor was not a woman who bowed to ruin. She was a woman who let ruin reshape her. That winter, something changed in her eyes, something sharp, cold, and frightening enough to make even her servants avoid her shadow. She started locking rooms that once overflowed with laughter. She held midnight meetings behind closed doors, voices low, the air thick with the smell of fear. And her daughters, beautiful, soft-spoken girls who once ran barefoot through the orchards, began to sense that their mother was watching them with a gaze that felt less like love and more like appraisal. Eleanor Harrow had been a widow for less than 3 months when the vultures began circling, not the kind that floated over the cotton fields, waiting for a mule to collapse, but the human kind. Lawyers, neighbors, curious county officials, all of them hovering around the edges of her grief like scavengers drawn to the scent of a fresh carcass. They wanted to see how she would survive, or more accurately, how she would fail. Harrow Estate had once been a jewel of Mississippi, but even from the road you could see the signs of decay, shutters barely hanging onto their hinges, barns leaning like old men losing their balance, fields that grew more weeds than cotton. Eleanor's husband, Thomas Harrow, had tended to the property with the same pride he tended to his reputation, but beneath that veneer was rot, financial rot, moral rot, a slow poison that had seeped into every beam and floorboard. When he died, the task of facing that truth settled on Eleanor's shoulders like a weight meant to break her. In the days following the funeral, she drifted through the house like a ghost, her footsteps silent on floors that creaked for everyone else. But silence could not hide the smell of mildew rising from the walls or the way the servants whispered behind her back about overdue wages and dwindling supplies. Every corner of the estate felt like an accusation, every room a reminder of a life that had slipped from abundance to barely controlled ruin. The neighbors, always too eager to gossip, watched with quiet anticipation. They expected Eleanor to fold under the pressure, to sell off the land piece by piece, to pack her daughters and her grief into a carriage and disappear into the anonymity of some distant town. They did not believe she had the resolve to fight. But Eleanor Harrow was not made of fragile grief. She was made of something colder, something carved from the harsh lessons of Southern womanhood. She knew what it meant to survive in a world that gave her sympathy only when it served others and respect only when she forced it from their hands. In those first weeks alone in the mansion, she studied the estate the way a battlefield commander studies terrain, taking stock of what remained, what was crumbling, and what could be salvaged. Every night, she walked the halls long after the lamps had burned low, her face lit by the wavering flame, her mind calculating the cost of survival. And every morning, she awoke with the same grim understanding that the estate was slipping away from her faster than she could patch its wounds. The rumors began quietly, a low murmur among the townsfolk that soon swelled into a river of gossip so persistent that even the wind seemed to carry it across the delta. Eleanor Harrow had inherited the estate, yes, but whispers clung to her like shadows, suggesting that the Harrow fortune was not the grand inheritance everyone assumed. People spoke in hushed tones about hidden debts, ledgers tucked away in locked drawers, and obligations her late husband had accumulated in secrecy, debts that could swallow the estate whole if left unchecked. Merchants who had once smiled at the Harrows now avoided eye contact, their polite nods replaced with subtle gestures of warning, as if Eleanor herself had become a creature to be wary of. The rumor mill painted her inheritance not as wealth, but as a trap, a gilded cage with walls of unpaid bills and legal snares, waiting to snap shut on the unwary heir. Eleanor felt the weight of those whispers even before she fully understood their implications. The first time she overheard the conversation at the general store, she had paused at the doorway, a basket of goods clutched in her hand, listening to the merchant speculate on her fortune. Their words were sharp, tinged with pity and fear, and Eleanor realized that they believed her naive, unprepared, and incapable of navigating the treacherous waters her husband had left behind. Each rumor seemed to carry a kernel of truth, a suggestion that Thomas Harrow had built more than cotton fields and barns. He had constructed a web of obligations, mortgages, and secret promises that now threatened to undo everything he had worked to create. As the days passed, the murmurs reached her ears through every channel imaginable. Servants muttered in kitchens and hallways, friends expressed concern with forced smiles, and even distant relatives arrived under the guise of support, though their eyes betrayed their true intentions. Eleanor began to understand that these whispers were more than idle chatter, they were warnings, echoes of a hidden reality she had not yet uncovered. The estate she had expected to walk into, a symbol of her late husband's legacy and her own security, was instead a labyrinth of uncertainty. Each rumor, no matter how veiled, seemed to hint at a looming danger, a financial specter that could strip her of her home, her status, and her future. The pressure mounted with each passing day, and Eleanor found herself moving through the rooms of her mansion with a growing awareness of unseen eyes, invisible threads of judgment and suspicion stretching toward her from every corner of the county. Even the landscape outside seemed to mirror the tension, the cotton fields heavy and unruly, the river sluggish and dark, carrying with it the sense of secrets waiting to surface, secrets that would demand payment long before mercy. It was on a gray afternoon, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy across the delta, that Eleanor Harrow finally confronted the truth her husband had buried beneath layers of charm and ambition. She had stumbled upon it quite by accident, a small leather-bound ledger tucked behind the false paneling in Thomas's study, its edges worn from years of secret handling. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, merely a record of accounts and transactions typical of any prosperous plantation, but as Eleanor turned the brittle pages, her heart sank. Each entry told a story of debts accumulated in quiet desperation, loans taken from distant merchants under obscure terms, and promises made to powerful men who would not wait for kindness or delay. The handwriting, neat yet urgent, betrayed Thomas's anxiety, a silent admission that he had known the walls of his estate were crumbling from within even as he smiled at guests and signed documents with ease. As Eleanor traced the ink-stained lines, she realized the full scope of the danger. There were clauses she had never seen in any will or deed, clauses that gave creditors and even distant relatives the power to seize the estate if any portion of the debts remained unpaid. Some of these obligations were contingent upon her direct ownership, meaning her inheritance was not free at all but shackled with conditions she could barely understand. One particular passage caused her stomach to tighten, a fine scrawl that left no room for negotiation. If the sum of obligations was not met within 2 years of Thomas's death, every acre, every building, and every possession of value would be forfeit, leaving Eleanor with nothing but the echo of her family name. The words seemed to shimmer on the page, as if mocking her, reminding her that the estate she had envisioned as her sanctuary was already a trap waiting to spring. In the days that followed, Eleanor revisited the ledger obsessively, seeking patterns, loopholes, anything that could provide reprieve, but the more she read, the more she understood the cold precision with which Thomas had bound her fate. Every entry revealed new creditors, unseen agreements, and clandestine deals that had enriched him in life but left devastation in his wake. The sheer magnitude of it was almost paralyzing, a weight pressing down on her chest that grew heavier with each passing hour. And yet, beneath the panic, there was a spark of calculation, a recognition that knowledge gave her a certain power. If she could decipher the full extent of her husband's secret obligations, if she could navigate the maze of contracts and clauses, then perhaps she could turn the trap into a weapon. But even as she contemplated her options, Eleanor could not ignore the chilling realization that time itself had become an enemy. Every hour brought the looming deadline closer, and with it, the certainty that the estate, her home, and everything her family had worked for might vanish forever, leaving only the cold ledger and the silent accusation of Thomas Harrow's careful, deliberate betrayal. Eleanor Harrow had long believed her daughters to be the embodiments of innocence, the living proof of her late husband's charm and the softness that once touched even the roughest edges of his character. But as she pored over the documents Thomas had left behind, a grim revelation unsettled her more profoundly than any debt or legal threat ever could. Buried within the fine print of the estate's legal records was a classification that stripped her daughters of the security she had assumed they possessed. The law, cold and unyielding, did not see them as simply her children. Instead, because of a faint and obscure trace of lineage in Thomas's bloodline, something that had gone unnoticed or ignored for decades, they were legally regarded as mulatto, a designation that carried with it a host of restrictions, vulnerabilities, and dangers. The weight of this discovery pressed on Eleanor like a living thing, a silent accusation echoing through the grand halls of her crumbling mansion. She tried to imagine what this classification meant in practical terms, and the picture it painted was horrifying. It was not simply a bureaucratic label, it was a sentence that made her daughters property in ways the law barely concealed, a category that made them susceptible to claims and sales, to exploitation masked under the guise of legality. The realization cut deeper because it collided violently with Eleanor's maternal instincts. The girls she had nurtured, clothed, and loved could be removed from her control at a moment's notice, their fates tied not to the affection of their mother but to the cold dictates of statutes written to enforce power and subjugation. Every glance at her children from that moment on carried a new terror, a recognition that their vulnerability was not only social or emotional but also legal, codified in ink and enforced by authorities who would see the law as unquestionable. Eleanor's mind raced as she considered the implications. It meant that every neighbor's smile, every handshake in the courthouse, every casual interaction with merchants and lawyers carried potential threats. Her daughter's very existence could be leveraged by anyone with ambition, anyone willing to exploit a loophole, anyone who understood the cruel intricacies of Mississippi law. And yet, the revelation also gave her a grim clarity. The estate, already teetering under the weight of debts and hidden obligations, was now inseparable from the security and survival of her children. Protecting one meant safeguarding the other, but the path forward was no longer simply financial, it was moral, strategic, and, above all, terrifyingly delicate. Every evening, Eleanor watched her daughters in the dim glow of the fading sunlight through the cracked windows, noting how they laughed, how they moved, how innocent they remained despite the invisible chains that the law had fastened to their lives. The knowledge of their classification became a shadow in her mind, following her from room to room, whispering of dangers she had never imagined, forcing her to confront a question that no mother should ever have to face: how far would she go to keep them safe, and at what cost to the very hearts she had sworn to protect? The first time Eleanor Harrow heard the whispers about the hidden value of her daughters, she thought she must have misheard. The men spoke in low tones, their words laced with something darker than mere commerce, something that made her skin crawl even as her mind struggled to comprehend. At the market, in the dim corners of taverns, and in the hushed corridors of the courthouse, traders, men who dealt in cotton, livestock, and other tangible wealth, spoke of children like objects to be measured and weighed. They hinted at the enormous sums certain buyers were willing to pay for girls who carried the blood of both privilege and secrecy, children who could be classified in ways that turned them into commodities in the most grotesque sense. Eleanor's stomach knotted with revulsion and disbelief, yet the words lodged themselves in her mind, persistent and intrusive. The concept was abhorrent, almost unthinkable. These were her daughters, her flesh and blood, the children she had kissed to sleep and taught to pray beneath the fading light of the chandeliers. And yet, in the eyes of men who saw only profit and opportunity, they were nothing more than assets, each with an appraised worth that could outweigh fields of cotton, herds of cattle, and even the legal claim she now struggled to assert over her estate. Eleanor walked the estate's overgrown fields at night, imagining the men she had seen at the river docks, measuring and evaluating, their calculating eyes tracing the outline of her daughters as though they were cataloging livestock. The thought made her shiver uncontrollably. She had inherited a wealth that was already precarious, and now she was confronted with a possibility that blurred the line between morality and survival in ways she had never anticipated. As the weeks went by, Eleanor found herself observing the traders more closely, attending auctions under disguises, listening as they spoke in cryptic codes about contracts, deliveries, and packages that were, in reality, human lives. Her initial shock gave way to a cold, gnawing fascination, a reluctant understanding of the leverage her daughters represented. Each whispered conversation, each veiled offer, revealed the stark truth: the estate's survival and her financial security could hinge on her willingness to treat the unimaginable as real, to consider her daughters not just as children but as bargaining chips in a game she had never wanted to play. Even as she recoiled from the thought, Eleanor could not ignore the logic behind it. The debts that haunted the estate loomed larger with every passing day, creditors patient yet relentless, and the law offered no mercy for ignorance. The notion that her daughters could be transformed into currency in secret markets, though monstrous, also presented a grim solution: if she could navigate the hidden networks, if she could understand the rules of the traders' cruel commerce, then perhaps she could protect the estate, manipulate her position, and ensure that the power and legacy of Harrow would survive. The realization settled over her like a fog, heavy, suffocating, and impossible to escape, forcing her to confront a darkness she had never imagined inhabiting her own heart. Eleanor Harrow had tried to push the traders' whispered offers from her mind, to convince herself that such conversations were mere rumor, the idle talk of men who saw the world only in profit and loss. Yet, curiosity, dark, insistent, and unsettling, drew her deeper into the shadowed world she had feared to acknowledge. One evening, under the cover of dusk and draped in a cloak that rendered her nearly invisible, she followed the murmured directions of a local broker, arriving at a narrow dock where the river lapped against weathered timbers. The air was thick with fog, carrying the metallic tang of commerce and something fouler, something that set her nerves on edge before she even saw the scene before her. Behind shuttered warehouses and crates stamped with mysterious marks, men bargained in whispers over lives rather than livestock, their faces lit by lanterns that threw long, trembling shadows across the boards. Eleanor watched from the darkness, her breath shallow, as girls not unlike her own were examined and appraised. They were measured in height, their skin scrutinized, their eyes catalogued with the cold precision of a ledger. Every movement, every gesture of the traders, was methodical, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its cruelty. Eleanor felt a chill crawl along her spine, a mixture of fear, revulsion, and a perverse fascination she could scarcely admit to herself. The realization hit with the force of a hurricane: this was not a one-time conversation or a fleeting suggestion. There was an entire hidden economy, a network of men who trafficked in innocence and blood, men who had learned to cloak their greed in legality and discretion, and they operated with impunity. She observed the interactions for hours, noting the subtle ways in which the traders signaled one another, the codes hidden in casual phrases, the exchanges of folded papers that seemed to carry the weight of entire lives. And as the night deepened, Eleanor's mind twisted with the possibilities. She saw the terrifying potential of what had been whispered to her, that her daughters, in the eyes of these men, were not merely children but valuable commodities whose worth could rival or surpass the lands, the buildings, and the debts that haunted Harrow Estate. The thought was horrifying, yet intoxicating in a way she could not deny. By the time the lanterns were extinguished and the last figures departed into the fog, Eleanor was no longer just an observer. The cold logic of survival had begun to weave itself around her heart. She understood, with a clarity that made her shiver, that knowledge of this secret trade gave her power. If she could master it, if she could manipulate it, then she might be able to save the estate, preserve her position, and secure the legacy of the Harrow name. And yet, beneath that calculation, a gnawing unease grew, a quiet, persistent dread whispering that in stepping closer to this world, she had also stepped closer to a darkness that might claim not only her conscience but the very souls of those she loved most. It was during one of the fog-laden evenings, when the river's mist curled around the docks like a living thing, that Eleanor Harrow first heard the offer that would shatter any remnants of innocence she had left. The broker, a man with a gaunt face and eyes like chipped onyx, spoke in tones that were almost cordial, yet carried an undercurrent of menace that made Eleanor's skin prickle. He did not speak in vague hypotheticals or idle suggestions. He laid the situation bare, cold and precise, as though reciting a ledger rather than a moral proposition. The estate's debts, he explained, were not merely inconvenient, they were insurmountable without intervention, a mountain of obligation that could swallow Harrow Estate whole unless extraordinary measures were taken. Then he paused, letting the weight of his words settle like dust in the damp air, before delivering the proposition that twisted Eleanor's stomach into knots. She could sell her daughters, quietly, discreetly, to certain buyers who would pay handsomely, and the estate could be cleared, her control preserved. The words struck Eleanor like a thunderclap. Her mind recoiled at the thought, twisting the image of her children into instruments of commerce, objects to be traded as if they were cattle or barrels of cotton. She saw their small hands, soft and warm in hers, and the laughter that had once filled the halls, and the very thought of putting them into the hands of strangers ignited a violent, nauseating panic. Yet beneath the visceral horror, there was a creeping recognition of the calculus before her. The broker's tone left no room for moral compromise. The debts were real, the timeline merciless, and the law offered her no mercy. Eleanor understood that the choice he presented, monstrous as it was also a path that could secure the very survival of Harrow Estate. For hours, Eleanor sat in the dim glow of her parlor, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across her face as she grappled with the proposition. Every argument, every rationalization she had ever clung to, fought against the unnatural logic of survival he had presented. The estate, the legacy of her husband, the future of her family's name, all hung in the balance, tethered to a decision that would mark her conscience forever. And yet, even as she wrestled with the revulsion, she could not entirely dismiss the broker's words. The promise of solvency, the restoration of control, the power to secure what had been promised by inheritance, all dangled before her, tantalizing and grotesque. In that oppressive silence, Eleanor felt the first seeds of transformation take root, a cold clarity settling over her. She realized that the world she had once known, where love and blood alone safeguarded her daughters, was gone. Survival demanded calculation, compromise, and a willingness to confront horrors she had never imagined she could endure. And while her heart screamed at the thought, a small, relentless voice whispered that the estate could yet be saved if she could summon the courage to navigate the darkness the broker had revealed. For a brief moment, Eleanor Harrow allowed herself to imagine refusing the broker's proposition, to reject the unthinkable path he had laid before her. She pictured her daughters safe, their laughter echoing through the halls as she moved among the decaying walls of Harrow Estate, untouched by the cold calculations of commerce and law. But reality, unyielding and merciless, pressed against her with the weight of inevitability. The debts were not rumors whispered by frightened merchants, they were inked into contracts, enforced by law, and poised to consume everything she had inherited the moment she faltered. Eleanor felt the crushing pressure of that inevitability settle over her like a suffocating fog, choking the room around her until every thought was sharpened to a singular clarity. Survival demanded a choice she could not morally accept, yet could not ignore. She tried to deny the thought at first, pacing the halls while the candle flames flickered and cast long, accusatory shadows across the cracked floors. She tried to cling to every shred of maternal instinct that told her to protect her daughters at all costs, to preserve the innocence that had so recently filled their home. But each step she took, each turn of her gaze to the overgrown fields beyond the windows, reminded her that the estate's very bones were crumbling under the weight of her husband's secrets. If she hesitated, if she allowed sentiment to dictate action, the entire legacy she had promised herself she would protect would vanish like smoke into the delta mist. In the quiet of that night, Eleanor felt a shift within herself, a cold, unrecognizable steel settling into her spine. It was not cruelty, not malice, it was resolve. She began to see her daughters not merely as children, but as instruments within a terrible equation she had been forced to confront. The estate, her social position, the power she had inherited and barely understood, all demanded action, and inaction was no longer an option. Her mind calculated with ruthless efficiency, every debt accounted for, every potential buyer, every loophole in the law that could be exploited. It was abhorrent, terrifying, and yet necessary. The decision crystallized in the stillness of the candlelit parlor, and Eleanor felt the bitter taste of inevitability press against her tongue. She would act, and she would act decisively, setting into motion a chain of events that would forever alter the lives of those she loved most. Love and instinct warred with logic and survival, but the practical voice within her, sharpened by years of necessity and observation, prevailed. She understood with horrifying clarity that to protect the estate, to secure the fragile illusion of power and safety, she would have to embrace the darkness the broker had presented. Her daughter's future, the estate's survival, and her own claim to the Harrow name now hinged on a choice that would forever mark the boundaries between mother, property, and a world she could no longer deny. Once Eleanor Harrow had made the decision that would define the rest of her life, the change in the household was immediate and undeniable. Her daughters, previously accustomed to a sense of security and maternal warmth, began to sense a subtle shift in her presence. It was not sudden or dramatic, there were no cruel words or outright punishments, but the atmosphere around them thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. Eleanor's eyes lingered longer on their movements, following them with a scrutiny that had not existed before. Every glance carried a cold deliberation, a measuring of behavior and posture as though she were appraising something precious yet alarmingly fragile. The girls began noticing the locked doors that had never been locked, the muffled whispers behind curtains, and the hurried conversations that ended abruptly whenever they approached. They felt, without understanding why, that their mother was no longer fully on their side, that a hidden part of her had shifted away from the familiar warmth they had once taken for granted. The servants, too, noticed the change. They moved cautiously through the hallways, eyes darting toward the parlor where Eleanor spent long hours poring over ledgers and letters, her fingers tracing inked lines with a determination that bordered on obsession. The girls asked questions, innocent inquiries that were met with vague replies or sudden silences. Eleanor's voice, once tender and reassuring, carried a new edge, an undertone of calculation and restraint that unnerved even the most loyal household staff. The air seemed to tighten around the family, each footstep echoing with the weight of impending decisions that none of them could fully articulate. As the days passed, the daughters began to internalize the subtle warnings that their mother's behavior offered. They noticed the way she lingered near the staircase, watching them descend as if evaluating every movement, every word, every small gesture of childhood innocence. They saw her slip from room to room with purpose, sometimes carrying folded papers, sometimes whispering to shadows, always moving with a resolve that was at once frightening and impenetrable. The mansion itself seemed to shift in response to her transformation. Doors that had always opened freely now resisted touch, windows that had been left ajar were firmly shut, and the rooms themselves seemed to harbor secrets that only Eleanor could read. For the daughters, the growing tension became an invisible barrier, a sense that their mother's love was no longer a simple, unquestioned certainty but something conditional, measured against a backdrop of fear and necessity. They began to sense, in fleeting glances and in the silence that followed their questions, that Eleanor's focus had shifted from comfort and nurture to observation and calculation. It was a subtle terror, more haunting than any punishment, because it was rooted not in anger or cruelty, but in the quiet, inexorable logic of a woman whose love had become entwined with survival, power, and decisions no child should ever be forced to comprehend. As the days bled into weeks, Eleanor Harrow's daughters began to notice an unsettling pattern, strangers appearing at the edges of the estate with an air that felt both casual and predatory. At first, it was a single man here or there, a visitor claiming interest in purchasing cotton or inspecting the barns, but their presence carried a quiet menace that the girls could feel but could not name. He would linger too long at the gates, his eyes scanning the property as if memorizing every detail, and sometimes, when Eleanor passed him briefly on the veranda, he would offer a nod that felt far too deliberate, calculated in a way that chilled them to the bone. Soon, more men arrived, always strangers, always observing with a detached intensity that made the girls' hearts pound and their steps falter. They began to whisper to one another, unsure if the danger was real or a shadow of imagination, but the instinctive fear in the pit of their stomachs would not be denied. The visitors did not enter the home openly, they measured from a distance, their presence a constant reminder that the girls were under scrutiny. Their gazes seemed to follow every movement, the way the daughters played in the overgrown orchards, the way they ran barefoot across the cracked floors, even the way they lingered in doorways. It was as if the men were assessing the girls not as children, not as human beings with needs and feelings, but as objects to be weighed, evaluated, and judged. Eleanor watched these men with a calmness that unnerved the girls, her expression unreadable, her eyes masking a calculation that they did not yet comprehend. The girls began to sense that their mother's composure was not comforting but collusive, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous transactions that might soon involve them. At night, the estate felt alive with whispers and footsteps, though no one admitted to hearing them. The riverboats, once distant and harmless, now seemed to carry secrets and possibilities of betrayal. Occasionally, a man would arrive late, a shadowy figure moving along the docks with the grace of someone accustomed to secrecy and discretion. Eleanor greeted him, her voice steady and polite, her daughters hidden in the corners of the rooms, trembling as they realized these visitors were assessing them in ways they could neither influence nor escape. The air around the estate thickened with anticipation, each evening stretching longer as the girls felt the invisible weight of the men's presence, a pressure that made their own home feel suddenly alien, unsafe, and predatory. Even the servants, who had grown accustomed to the peculiarities of the Harrow household, began to murmur quietly about the stranger's intent, their hushed voices betraying an anxiety that Eleanor never directly addressed but clearly understood. The daughters realized, with an expanding sense of dread, that their lives were no longer entirely their own. Each visit, each calculated glance, and each measured approach of the men seemed to narrow the space in which they could move freely, binding them with invisible chains that Eleanor's calm watchfulness only intensified. The estate, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a stage for a careful evaluation, one in which the daughters were the central, terrified participants, and Eleanor's eyes were always upon them, assessing, measuring, and preparing for a choice they could not yet fathom. The day the eldest daughter stumbled upon the bill of sale was the day the fragile veil of safety that had clung to the Harrow household shattered completely. She had been exploring the study, a room she had once thought of as a repository of her father's legacy, filled with dusty ledgers and forgotten correspondence. The flickering candlelight caught the edges of an envelope tucked beneath a pile of papers, and curiosity, innocent and unrelenting, drew her to it. When she unfolded the contents, the words leapt from the page like a blade. Her name, precise and deliberate, was written among others, accompanied by figures that denoted value and terms that denoted finality. The bill of sale was unmistakable in its intent. She, a child, had been assigned a price, a sum to be delivered to some unseen buyer, and the transaction had been set in motion. Shock rooted her to the floor. Her small hands trembled as she traced the letters, her mind struggling to reconcile the words with the life she had known. Her mother, who had once been the source of comfort and protection, had become a figure of calculation, a silent participant in arrangements that reduced innocence to currency. The betrayal cut sharper than any harsh word or act of violence could have. It was a quiet, insidious violation, a contract signed in secrecy that rendered her powerless before forces she could neither understand nor resist. The room itself seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening as if the very walls of the study were complicit in the treachery she had just uncovered. When she confronted the document with tentative fingers, the details of the contract became horrifyingly clear. Dates, signatures, and clauses meticulously outlined the logistics of her transfer, the terms under which she would be removed from the estate, and the authority her mother had granted in the process. The ledger revealed a network of men prepared to execute the plan, men who had been observed arriving in secret at the docks, whose intent had now been made undeniable. The realization was suffocating. Her mother had already agreed to the arrangement, and every day that passed brought the execution of this plan closer, leaving her with a creeping sense of inevitability. Terror mixed with a strange, helpless anger as she clutched the papers to her chest. The very foundation of her childhood, the sense of safety, trust, and maternal care, had been rewritten in ink and contract. In the flickering light, the study seemed transformed into a place of conspiracy, a room that held not only the remnants of her father's dealings but also the blueprint for her own loss. She felt the weight of the world shift, understanding that the life she had taken for granted was being dismantled by the very person who had sworn to protect her, and that the estate she had called home was now a place where every creaking floorboard, every shadowed corner, and every quiet glance held the promise of betrayal she could neither evade nor undo. The attempt to flee came late one night, when the house was steeped in silence and the moon had carved pale slivers of light across the overgrown courtyard. The eldest daughter, her small frame trembling with fear and determination, whispered to her younger sister, urging her to move quickly, to escape the invisible trap that had been closing around them since the arrival of the first traders. Every step was measured, careful, a delicate dance to avoid the creaking floorboards and the shadowed eyes of servants who might betray their movement. Their hearts hammered in their chests, a frantic rhythm that threatened to give them away, yet the promise of freedom, the desperate need to reclaim agency over their own lives, pushed them onward with a quiet, almost reckless courage. The doors that had once opened without thought now resisted, stiff and unyielding, as if anticipating the girl's rebellion. Eleanor's mansion, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and warmth, seemed to have transformed overnight into a labyrinth of vigilance, every corridor and landing a potential snare. They moved through the rooms with whispered prayers on their lips, the shadows stretching long and threatening across the walls as though the very house itself were conspiring against them. Every sound, the shuffle of a foot, the rustle of fabric, the distant groan of a timber, became amplified, a harbinger of capture, and yet they pressed forward, propelled by a desperation that overrode fear with fierce determination. Their plan, however, was doomed from the start. Men, quiet and deliberate, had been observing from the periphery, their patience and cunning unmatched. The brokers and their agents, the very men Eleanor had engaged in secret, were always a step ahead, anticipating moves and countering them with unerring precision. The daughters, still innocent in their understanding of the world, could not contend with the network of vigilance and calculation that had been arrayed against them. When they reached the outer courtyard, hoping for the cover of darkness and the obscuring fog of the Delta night, hands seized them from behind. They struggled, voices rising in terror, but the grip of their captors was ironclad, trained to subdue without leaving marks. In the moments that followed, the girls realized with a crushing horror that escape was not a possibility within the walls their mother had claimed to protect them. Eleanor, watching from a distance, did not intervene. Her presence, calm and composed, was an acknowledgment of the inevitability that had been set into motion. The daughters' pleas, their frantic cries, were swallowed by the night, echoing against the high ceilings and darkened hallways, leaving only the memory of terror, betrayal, and powerlessness. In that instant, they understood that the world outside the house had been carefully fenced, that every freedom had been anticipated and denied, and that their mother's resolve, cold and unflinching, had transformed the very air around them into a cage of calculation from which there was no immediate reprieve. The night the contract was signed, a storm rolled across the Mississippi Delta with a ferocity that seemed almost to mirror the tempest raging inside Eleanor Harrow. The wind lashed at the mansion, rattling shutters and tearing at the thin curtains, while sheets of rain pounded the roof and ran in rivulets down the warped clapboard walls. Lightning illuminated the estate in sudden, blinding flashes, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the hallways, and thunder shook the very foundations of the house as if the heavens themselves were protesting the act about to be committed. Eleanor stood at the massive oak desk in the study, her fingers poised over the ink, her expression calm but carved from stone, a mask that concealed every tremor of guilt, fear, and anticipation that surged beneath her composed exterior. The daughters had been sent to the far wing of the house, ostensibly to bed, but in reality to prevent them from witnessing the finality of their mother's decision. Eleanor could hear the muffled sounds of the storm outside, the wailing of the wind through broken panes, the steady, insistent drumming of rain, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. The contract lay before her, the pages crisp and cold, the ink already dry in some areas, waiting for her signature to complete the transaction. She paused, the quill heavy in her hand, feeling the weight of the consequences press down like the oppressive air before a storm. Every clause, every stipulation, every carefully worded provision had been reviewed, yet it was the finality of her action, the permanence, that froze her in a moment of suspended horror. As the first peal of thunder shook the house, Eleanor bent forward and began to write, her pen scratching across the paper in deliberate strokes, each one sealing the fate she had dreaded to acknowledge. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if echoing the beating of her heart, and for a fleeting instant, she imagined the cries of her daughters, the panic in their eyes, the desperate struggle they had attempted in the past weeks. The image was sharp and clear, a blade against her conscience, but she pressed on, each word, each signature, a nail in the coffin of innocence. When the final flourish of the quill touched the paper, the deed was complete. Eleanor straightened, the room suddenly feeling colder, the shadows longer, the storm somehow more intimate, more accusing. She sat back in the chair, staring at the contract as the rain pounded the roof, understanding with a sickening clarity that nothing could undo what had been done. The contract was no longer just ink on parchment, it was a promise, a command, a declaration of power wielded at the expense of her daughter's freedom. Outside, the wind screamed and lightning split the sky, and Eleanor realized, with a hollow and unsteady breath, that she had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return, and that the mansion, the estate, and the lives of her children were now irreversibly bound to the darkness she had set in motion. The moment the contract left her hands, Eleanor Harrow felt the weight of her daughter's absence settle like a physical presence in the halls of the estate. The girls had been taken to the river docks under the cover of night, and as the carriage wheels receded into the fog, a strange silence filled the mansion, broken only by the sighing of the wind through the broken shutters and the distant rumble of the river. The eldest daughter's eyes had burned with a mixture of fear, sorrow, and fury as she realized the finality of the situation, and from that moment, the curse of words unspoken and promises broken seemed to hang between mother and child, a tension heavier than any storm that had ever passed over the delta. In the echoing quiet of the house, Eleanor could almost hear the whispered condemnation, feel the weight of anger and betrayal that the girls carried even as they were carried farther from her grasp. The curse they had spoken was simple, yet it lingered like smoke in her mind, a dark refrain she could neither dismiss nor silence. "The land will never let you keep it," they had whispered in tones more haunting than any scream, their words carrying a precision and clarity that pierced through the layers of calm she had tried to cultivate. It was not a literal threat, but a recognition of cause and effect, a prophecy of imbalance that her motherly heart could feel even before her mind could quantify it. The estate, which had always seemed unshakable in its presence, now felt vulnerable, its halls hollow, its fields restless, and its very soil seemed to hum with an awareness of the betrayal that had taken place. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle in the trees outside, became amplified in her imagination, carrying the weight of judgment that she could neither escape nor appease. As the days passed, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes in the household, small signs that seemed almost supernatural in their implication. Servants spoke less freely, eyes darting to her as though measuring her culpability. Animals in the stables grew skittish, refusing to follow orders they had obeyed without hesitation. The river, once a placid presence at the edge of the property, appeared darker, slower, more deliberate in its movement, as if carrying away more than just water. And in the quietest hours of night, Eleanor sometimes swore she heard small footsteps echoing across the halls, the soft padding of children who were not there, a spectral reminder of the voices that had cursed her in the storm-dark night. The daughter's absence, the finality of the contract, and the whispered curse became a persistent weight pressing on Eleanor's mind, making every decision she faced afterward feel irrevocable, charged with a tension that bordered on the unbearable. Even as she tried to focus on the management of the estate, on the ledgers and the debts and the cold logic that had driven her to this point, the echoes of that moment, their voices, their anger, and the promise of retribution carried in the soil and the shadows, remained, a haunting presence that shadowed every waking thought and every step she took across the ground she had so desperately fought to preserve. The Harrow estate, once a place of quiet authority and distant reverence, had begun to show the first signs of decay that no ledger, no contract, and no calculated decision could conceal. Eleanor Harrow had thought that securing her daughters and maintaining the illusion of control over the estate would be enough to preserve the family's legacy, but reality proved far less forgiving. The land itself seemed to react to the betrayals enacted within its boundaries, as if the soil remembered the innocence it had nourished and now recoiled at the cold transactions that had taken place. Cotton fields, once orderly and proud, had grown wild and tangled, rows breaking into disorder that reflected the disruption within the mansion walls. The barns sagged further under the weight of years and neglect, and even the river that had once offered both commerce and solace appeared sluggish and darkened, carrying with it an oppressive sense of inevitability. Eleanor observed the change with a mix of frustration and unease. She had devoted herself to the meticulous maintenance of accounts, to carefully balancing debts and obligations, believing that logic and precision could shield her from the consequences of her decisions. Yet the estate's decline was stubborn, indifferent to reason, and her efforts seemed to falter against forces she could not control. Servants whispered in corners, their loyalty wavering in the face of fear and uncertainty, and even tradesmen who had once greeted her with deference now lingered with cautious suspicion. Each day, the mansion felt heavier, the walls pressing in, the floors groaning under a weight that was no longer just physical but moral and psychological, a cumulative burden of secrecy, betrayal, and fear. As the estate's physical deterioration became apparent, Eleanor also confronted the unraveling of her social authority. Neighbors and local officials, once hesitant to question the widow, began to speculate openly about the state of the Harrow household. Rumors traveled faster than the riverboats, distorted and amplified, carrying hints of scandal and impropriety. Eleanor's once imposing presence at social gatherings, her measured politeness and cold composure, now seemed brittle, as if the invisible threads that held her reputation together were fraying. Even her closest acquaintances observed her with guarded curiosity, unsure if she had been broken by grief, fear, or the weight of secrets that no one dared to articulate aloud. The combination of environmental decay, social scrutiny, and internal anxiety created a tension that Eleanor could neither escape nor fully confront. Every step across the creaking floors reminded her that control was slipping through her fingers, that the careful balance she had tried to maintain, between survival, morality, and legacy, was fracturing under pressures she had not foreseen. The estate, like her conscience, seemed to rebel against her calculated authority, asserting its own rhythm of consequence, decay, and inevitable reckoning. Even as Eleanor continued her careful accounting, her sharp observations, and her cold strategizing, she could sense that some forces, those born of human resentment, natural entropy, and the unyielding judgment of history, were moving faster than she could measure, threatening to undo everything she had fought so desperately to preserve. By the time Eleanor Harrow realized the full implications of the estate's decay, the repercussions of her decisions had begun to ripple outward in ways she had never anticipated. The first signs came subtly: a barn door left swinging in the wind after a storm, a shipment of cotton arriving damaged, and servants who no longer met her gaze but instead whispered in corners, casting furtive glances toward the parlor where she spent her days reviewing ledgers. Each small failure, each overlooked detail, carried with it the weight of cumulative neglect and a sense of inevitability. Eleanor could feel the estate itself rebelling against her efforts, as if the land and its buildings had absorbed the moral compromise she had enacted and now conspired in quiet retribution. Eleanor's mind, always sharp and calculating, recognized patterns in the failures. Creditors began pressing harder, their letters arriving with increasingly urgent language, some even mentioning the legal recourse they could take if debts were not satisfied promptly. Traders, once willing to operate on casual agreements and subtle promises, now demanded payment in advance, their patience exhausted by the delays that stemmed from Eleanor's internal turmoil. Every interaction became a negotiation charged with tension, the stakes higher than ever, and Eleanor felt the creeping sensation of being trapped in a game whose rules were constantly shifting, governed not by logic alone but by resentment, fear, and the hidden consequences of her previous choices. The estate's decay was mirrored in Eleanor's personal isolation. Friends and acquaintances who had once expressed concern in sympathetic tones now approached her with thinly veiled suspicion. Invitations to social gatherings dwindled, and letters of correspondence, once warm and supportive, began to carry undertones of judgment or veiled criticism. Even the servants, those she had relied upon to maintain the household's appearance of normalcy, had begun to act with subtle subversion, their compliance increasingly conditional on her attention and scrutiny. Eleanor understood that this erosion of loyalty was not merely social, it was structural, an indicator of the broader instability that her moral compromises had introduced into the estate's foundation. Worse still, the estate's natural rhythm seemed to echo the chaos within. Crops failed in unexpected patches, livestock succumbed to illness that had previously been uncommon, and the river's currents carried debris that disrupted shipping and threatened to undermine the docks. Eleanor could not dismiss these as mere coincidence. Each event seemed inextricably tied to the decisions she had made, a reflection of the tension between her desire to preserve the estate and the growing consequences of the darkness she had embraced. The land, the household, and the community around her were all responding in concert, a symphony of retribution that Eleanor could neither escape nor fully predict, and she began to understand with chilling clarity that the ripples of her choices would extend far beyond her immediate control. The first sign that Eleanor Harrow's influence over the estate was waning came in the form of the local merchants, whose demeanor shifted subtly but unmistakably. Where once they had approached her with deferential smiles and polite bowing, they now maintained a cautious distance, their words measured, their eyes flicking toward the horizon as if weighing potential threats and opportunities alike. Eleanor noticed it immediately, the way a shipment of cotton that had been promised without question now arrived late, partially spoiled, with an accompanying letter that implied negligence on her part. She felt the cold prickle of unease, the first true indication that the veneer of authority she had clung to was beginning to crack. As the days stretched into weeks, Eleanor observed more evidence of her fading control. Servants, long loyal to her household, began to show signs of subtle defiance, small acts that might have been ignored in times past but now felt like deliberate tests of her authority. Windows left unlocked, tools misplaced, and minor delays in critical chores began to accumulate, each incident a ripple in the fragile structure she had worked tirelessly to maintain. She realized, with a sinking heart, that her meticulous attention to ledgers and contracts could not compensate for the intangible erosion of loyalty and fear, the psychological and social currency that had once upheld her power. Beyond the walls of the estate, Eleanor could feel the shift in the county's perception of her. Neighbors who had once approached her with cautious respect now murmured behind hands or exchanged glances that carried unspoken commentary. At social gatherings, she was subtly excluded from discussions of trade and politics, her advice increasingly questioned, her presence tolerated rather than welcomed. Even distant relatives, who had once deferred to her stewardship of the estate, began to voice concerns with pointed politeness, suggesting that her judgment might be clouded, that the debts she so carefully calculated might bring ruin despite her apparent competence. The realization was suffocating. The social infrastructure that had sustained her authority was faltering, eroded not by one dramatic act but by the accumulation of choices, fears, and compromises that had left her vulnerable to scrutiny and challenge. The estate itself seemed to mirror this decay. Fields that had once yielded predictable harvests now produced erratic crops, barns developed new structural weaknesses, and livestock suffered from ailments that had previously been rare. Even the river, long a dependable route for commerce, carried silt and debris that complicated shipments and created new obstacles for trade. Eleanor understood with growing dread that these were not random misfortunes but consequences of the decisions she had made, the moral compromises she had embraced, and the fear she had imposed upon those around her. Each failure, each whispered slight, and each environmental disruption reinforced a single truth: her power was no longer absolute, and the estate she had fought to preserve was slipping into a state of vulnerability she could neither fully control nor easily reverse. The repercussions of Eleanor Harrow's choices became increasingly visible as rumors began to circulate through the small towns along the Mississippi River, carried by traders, servants, and the occasional wandering traveler. Whispers of the widow who had bartered her daughters to save her estate spread slowly at first, often couched in vague phrases and hushed tones, but they carried an unmistakable weight, a sense of scandal that seemed to ripple through every conversation. Merchants would glance toward her carriage with calculating eyes, neighbors would exchange furtive glances as she passed, and even the courthouse officials, once deferential and pliant, now observed her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The estate, once a fortress of respectability, had become a stage upon which Eleanor's moral compromise was displayed, and every visitor carried with them the potential to expose her secret to a wider audience. Eleanor felt the first stirrings of paranoia as she realized how swiftly information could travel and how fragile the mask of propriety truly was. She observed every interaction, scrutinized every letter, and questioned every courier, but the nature of rumor is its unpredictability. One poorly worded letter, one careless servant, or one sharp-tongued merchant could ignite suspicion and magnify a whisper into accusation. The awareness that her daughter's fates, and, by extension, her own survival, were tied to secrecy placed a relentless pressure on Eleanor's mind, a constant tension that sharpened her focus but also eroded the sense of calm she had tried to cultivate. The estate, once a symbol of stability and power, now seemed to teeter on the edge of exposure, vulnerable to the slightest breach of discretion. Even those within her household were not immune to the growing climate of fear and mistrust. Servants moved with a mix of caution and calculation, their loyalty now tempered by the knowledge that their mistress's reputation, and by extension their own positions, was precarious. Every command from Eleanor carried an unspoken warning, every glance an evaluation of potential complicity or betrayal. The daughters, still young but keenly perceptive, began to sense the tension, the constant undercurrent of danger that had become woven into the very fabric of the home. The mansion, once filled with laughter and quiet reassurance, now vibrated with anticipation and anxiety, each creak of the floorboards and gust of wind outside magnifying the fear that permeated the household. Eleanor herself became increasingly isolated, retreating into long hours of study and ledger examination, trying to control the narrative through careful management of accounts and property, yet knowing that money and documents could not protect her from social exposure or moral condemnation. The weight of rumor pressed on her like a living thing, infiltrating her dreams, shadowing her every movement, and making her realize that the consequences of her choices were no longer confined to the estate. Each whisper, each sideways glance, and each hesitant greeting reminded her that the world outside the mansion's walls had begun to measure her not by the wealth she controlled, but by the moral compromises she had enacted to secure it, and that this scrutiny would follow her, relentless and unforgiving, into every corner of her life. The consequences of Eleanor Harrow's decisions reached their most personal and agonizing apex when her daughters began to vanish from the margins of her life entirely, removed from the estate and thrust into the hands of strangers whose intent was merciless and calculating. The eldest daughter, once a lively and curious presence, had become a ghost in Eleanor's memory, her laughter and questions now distant echoes carried only in dreams that offered no comfort. The younger girl, equally intelligent and spirited, had been shipped along similar lines, her small frame swallowed by the night and by a system designed to commodify innocence. Eleanor's control over their lives, once absolute, had been surrendered, and the realization settled over her like a dense, suffocating fog that left no space for escape. In her heart, a storm raged, blending fear, guilt, and a gnawing despair that would not be assuaged by wealth, ledger entries, or calculated strategies. The estate, once a symbol of autonomy and protection, now felt hollowed out, its walls echoing with absence rather than authority. Eleanor wandered the halls at night, tracing the outlines of rooms her daughters had once inhabited, imagining their small hands touching walls and banisters she could no longer feel. Each empty doorway, each silent room, became a reminder of the irrevocable consequences of her choices, the proof that power exercised coldly, even with strategic foresight, could never substitute for the warmth and protection she had stripped away. Shadows clung to the corners of the mansion, and the wind through broken windows sounded less like a natural lament and more like a chorus of accusation, the echoes of innocence she had traded now haunting her relentlessly. Even in the management of the estate, Eleanor found her strategies faltering. Traders and merchants, once willing to negotiate under her guidance, sensed the subtle weakening in her command, a vulnerability that had emerged not from external pressure alone but from the internal fracture caused by her moral compromise. Every transaction, every shipment, and every ledger entry carried with it a haunting reminder of what she had sacrificed and what she no longer fully controlled. The river, once a conduit for commerce, now seemed to carry her anxieties downstream, the currents reflecting the unpredictable consequences of the system she had engaged in. Within her own consciousness, Eleanor experienced a relentless tension between necessity and conscience, the recognition that the daughter's absence was both the solution to immediate survival and the source of an enduring, inescapable torment. She understood that no wealth, no estate, and no social standing could repair the rupture she had created in the lives of those she loved. The realization was visceral and unrelenting. Her daughters were gone, and with them, the illusions of protection, maternal control, and moral rectitude that had once defined her identity. Every creak of the mansion, every glance at the river, and every shadowed room reminded her that her choices had permanently altered the trajectory of lives she had once sworn to safeguard, leaving her to navigate a world steeped in the consequences of betrayal, commerce, and irrevocable loss. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor Harrow began to understand the full scope of the ripple effects her choices had unleashed, and the estate itself seemed to manifest her guilt in every detail of its decay. The once proud mansion creaked under the weight of neglect, its paint peeling in long strips and its shutters hanging crookedly from rusted hinges. Every room she entered carried a faint echo of absence, the study where contracts had been signed, the hallways where her daughters had once played, and the bedrooms now silent, empty, and cold. Eleanor moved through these spaces like a specter, acutely aware that every decision she had made, each act of calculation intended to preserve her power, had left an indelible mark on the very walls around her. The estate was no longer a symbol of control or authority but a haunted witness to the moral compromises that had been enacted within its walls. The community, too, began to respond in ways Eleanor had neither anticipated nor desired. Traders and neighbors who had once deferred to her authority now approached with veiled suspicion or subtle avoidance. Gossip, once whispered in shadowed corners, gained momentum as tales of the widow who had bartered her daughters reached ears eager for scandal. The estate's social position, built over decades of careful navigation and family prestige, began to crumble, and Eleanor could feel the invisible judgment pressing in from every direction. Letters arrived with thinly disguised reproach, invitations ceased, and the networks of influence she had relied upon to maintain her position became unreliable at best, hostile at worst. It was as if the world itself was enacting a slow, inevitable retribution for the choices she had made in desperation. Within the household, the tension was palpable. Servants moved with cautious deliberation, their obedience tempered by fear and resentment. Even the smallest errors, once trivial, were now magnified, interpreted as evidence of mismanagement or moral weakness. Eleanor's presence, once commanding, now elicited unease. The careful veneer of order she had maintained was fracturing under the weight of her own conscience and the external pressures that her actions had provoked. She realized, with a grim clarity, that the estate's survival was no longer merely a matter of finance or law but of sustaining a fragile equilibrium between authority, fear, and secrecy. Yet the most piercing consequence of all was internal. Eleanor was acutely aware that the absence of her daughters, the irrevocable bargains she had struck, and the moral compromises she had embraced would haunt her indefinitely. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind through broken shutters, every flash of lightning across the Delta night seemed to remind her of the lives she had sacrificed to maintain control, of the innocence lost, and of the legacy forever tarnished. The estate, the community, and her conscience were all inextricably bound to the consequences of her choices, creating a web of tension, regret, and fear from which she could see no escape, a permanent shadow that would follow her through every remaining day of her life.